Good afternoon. My name is William Hubbard. I have the privilege of serving as chair of the board of the World Justice Project. At this time, I'd like to invite our indefatigable and brilliant president of the American Bar Association, Hillary Bass, to come forward and give opening remarks. Hillary?
Thank you, William, and thanks everyone for attending this important session today. I think everybody recognizes that today more than ever, lawyers play a critical role across our world and certainly in our country. One of the most interesting things throughout my travels this year as the president of the American Bar Association is to recognize how importantly American lawyers are viewed throughout the world. We are really seen as having a unique role to fill. My most recent international visit was to Poland, and sitting and talking to hundreds of judges who faced possibly a disciplinary court if they ruled against the government, and how ecstatic they were that the ABA's president thought it important enough to come talk to them about how we could help. It was really a unique experience. And then, of course, what we know is going on in the border is just another example of how critical a time it is for lawyers to rise up and ensure that we don't have 3-year-olds going into immigration court without counsel, to ensure that every separated parent is reunited with their children. And that's a role that only lawyers can play. And certainly one of the most important things that this association stands for is ensuring that there is justice for all and that the rule of law is supported anywhere in the world. For more than 25 years, the ABA Rule of Law Initiative and our partners have sought to strengthen the rule of law throughout the world, to strengthen legal institutions, to support legal professionals, and to foster respect for human rights and to advance the public understanding of the law and of citizens' rights throughout the world. However, now we realize we must invest domestically because our failure to do so over the last few generations is clearly having an impact on the way our general population views our institutions, and it is worrisome. So as you embark today about the critical issues of the intersection of the rule of law and America's criminal justice system, I would ask that you think deeply about current events and their possible implications on the rule of law in this country. We know that the rule of law is fundamental to every democracy. Strengthening the rule of law must be approached not only by focusing on the applications of norms and procedures, but we need to consider new, sustainable solutions to the pressing rule of law challenges. We must think creatively and innovatively. The ABA and WJP have put together a program full of experts to help explore these issues. I know you are going to have a productive and thought-provoking afternoon, and I thank you so much for attending this important program. Thank you.
Hillary, thank you very much for your strong and steadfast leadership at this time when so many of the institutions that we have long trusted are under assault from so many different directions. And this is a crucial time for our country, and having a program focused on the rule of law in our own country, I think, is critical. And we appreciate your helping us and being a partner in this effort. Hillary, thank you very much. Again, my name is William Hubbard. I have the privilege of serving as chair of the board of the World Justice Project, and on behalf of the board of directors and our entire team, I thank you all for coming this afternoon to explore with us some crucial issues at the intersection of the rule of law and America's criminal justice system. For those of you new to the World Justice Project, we are an independent, multidisciplinary organization working to advance the rule of law around the world. Why the rule of law? Effective rule of law reduces corruption, combats poverty and disease, and protects people from injustices, large and small. We believe it is the foundation for communities of equity, opportunity, and peace. And our founding chair reminds us to put those words in that particular order. undermining development, accountable government, and respect for fundamental rights. The rule of law matters in terms of economic, socio-political, and human development. With more rule of law comes higher GDP, greater democracy and peace, and better education and health outcomes. The WJP has worked for more than a decade to produce a universal definition of the rule of law and to develop rigorous technical indicators for assessing adherence. We measure how the rule of law is experienced and perceived by the general public worldwide with the WJP Rule of Law Index. Again, this is not just an index of the laws on the books, but it is how the law is applied and people perceive and experience the rule of law in their own communities in these 113 countries that we work with. The index relies on more than 110,000 household and expert surveys in 113 countries and growing. It is considered the world's leading source for original independent data on the rule of law, and more influential global organizations are looking to the World Justice Project for our assessment of the rule of law as they execute on their strategic plans to strengthen the rule of law and assess deficiencies worldwide. In our latest edition of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, released in January of this year, the United States slipped to 19th out of 113 countries surveyed. For a country built on the bedrock of the rule of law, this should give us pause. And if we look more closely at the data, criminal justice was the worst area of performance for the U.S. among the 8 factors. Comparing our criminal justice performance against our income peers, we see that the United States is ranked 20th out of 35 high-income countries. Many of us see firsthand how dysfunction in the criminal justice system hurts individuals, families, and communities. We see how the entire system, from criminal policy and laws to enforcement and judgment to incarceration and rehabilitation, fundamentally affects core rule of law dimensions, including public safety, the rights of individuals, the accountability of those who enforce the law, and the fairness and effectiveness of our courts. Today, our goal is to explore these critically important issues in greater detail with the hope of coming away with a deeper understanding of where we stand and what we can do about it. At this time, I'd like to thank the ABA and specifically the ABA's Division of Public Education and the ABA's Criminal Justice Section for their partnership and collaboration in holding this session. The World Justice Project began as an ABA presidential initiative under Bill Newcomb, and due to this shared DNA, the World Justice Project continues to feel a close kinship and appreciation for the ABA's work. Before I'd go, I'd like to point out to you the handouts in your seats, where you will find behind today's agenda some biographical information about the experts who will be sharing their insights with us today. This program is being videotaped and will soon be posted on our website if you want to go back and review some of the comments and presentations made today. With that, I'm greatly privileged and honored to welcome Betsy Anderson, Executive Director of the World Justice Project, and Chuck Rosenberg, former Acting Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, to the stage, and they're already here to develop our and engage in our keynote conversation. So thank you both for being here, and we look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for that nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to be engaging in what is a really important conversation for the rule of law at the ideal forum here at the American Bar Association. Criminal justice is really where rule of law hits the rule of law rubber hits the road. It's where we see government held accountable, where we see human rights upheld, and where we see checks and balances that are critical to the rule of law. And so it's particularly important that we focus our exploration of the rule of law on the criminal justice system. And we're delighted to have a terrific expert to help frame that conversation today. Our session will be in two parts. First, a conversation with Chuck Rosenberg, and then a panel of experts sharing their perspective on the rule of law in the criminal justice system in the United States, gaps and steps that they and their organizations are taking to fill them. But we're pleased to start with this conversation with Chuck, who has had a very distinguished career at the highest levels of the criminal justice system here in the United States. Chuck's bio is in your materials, but I have to elaborate a little bit because it is impressive, just a little bit. Chuck has worked for decades in the Justice Department on some of the biggest terrorism, anti-corruption, and espionage cases. He ran the DEA, as William mentioned. He served on the staff of FBI directors Mueller and Comey, and as a U.S. attorney in two critical and very challenging jurisdictions. Now he's returned to private practice, where he is playing another critical rule of law role as a commentator, frequent commentator on MSNBC, explaining the criminal justice system to our public. So we're delighted to have you with us, Chuck, and eager to hear from you and about your experience at this nexus of rule of law and criminal justice.
Well, thanks, Betsy, and thanks for having me.
Let's maybe start with your perspectives on the rule of law generally. You've made rule of law really a hallmark of your career and spoken out on rule of law principles at various times. Tell us what this concept means to you, why it's important, and how it has informed your work in the criminal justice system.
Three difficult questions. I've always seen our work as tethered to the Constitution and the rule of law. And that, in some ways, is the easy part. It's incredibly easy to say that, but executing on it, I think, is very different. One example, when I was asked to run the DEA, which is something I never thought I would do. Ironically enough, in all my time as a federal prosecutor, I had never prosecuted a single drug case. So hadn't really worked with the men and women of the DEA before. It struck me as odd that when I got there, they had no core values program, something that we had at the Department of Justice, something that we had at the FBI, but the DEA didn't have one. And in no way is that meant to diminish the work they had been doing, but my sense was that you have to be tethered to something. There has to be a common language, a common denominator, a common currency, and everyone has to agree on what it is. Military does a superb job at that. I think law enforcement, it tends to be a little more spotty. And so my goal was to change the language a little bit, that we would talk about the rule of law, we would talk about integrity, we would talk about service, we would talk about others over self. And that if that became part of the currency and we trained on it and we taught on it and we recruited for it and we developed it, we would execute better.
Mm-hmm. Did those definitions, those core values, differ agency to agency that you worked in?
Not really. I think what differs from agency to agency is how much attention you pay to them and how seriously you take it. So my goal at the DEA was to have core values part of our training. Every new agent, every new analyst, every new chemist who graduates from Quantico gets a DEA core values card in their credentials case. And what I liked as I traveled around the country, I went to visit 120 offices when I was at the DEA. I did not travel as Scott Pruitt did. I was usually in the middle seat next to the bathroom on a commercial flight. Is that how many people had printed off our core values from the internet or had posted their card at their cubicle. Just seeing that over and over actually was very gratifying.
Absolutely. And maybe that's an interesting segue to explore the experience you had at the DEA. You quite famously now.
I wasn't shooting for fame, I can assure you.
You wrote it, what was intended to be, I understand, an internal memo that then became public, maybe referencing those core values, which you expressed concern about a speech by the president, President Trump, and which you characterized, quote, that he had condoned police misconduct regarding the treatment of individuals placed under arrest by law enforcement. Tell us about that and that experience.
About a year ago now, President Trump gave a speech in Suffolk County, New York, in which he said, where he wondered aloud why we treated defendants that we arrested so gently, and joked about not putting our hand on their heads as we helped them into police cars. The clear implication to me was that police violence police brutality was acceptable and encouraged. And we've been sending exactly the opposite message for as long as I've been in law enforcement. And, it just bothered me to my core, Betsy. And I'm not a political person. I don't give a damn about politics. But it bothered me to my core. And so I was up most of that night, tossing and turning, decided to write an email to our troops. Got up at 3 in the morning, wrote it, rewrote it again, went into the office, went back and forth about whether or not I should send it, because my concern was that we'd be dragging the DEA into a political fight. We just want to keep our heads down and do our work. But eventually at around 8 a.m. I hit send. It was incredibly liberating. I went home and went back to sleep. And I think by 8:30 the New York Times had it. So it was never my intention, but I wanted to reiterate, at least to the men and women of DEA, how we thought about ourselves and our role and our job, which includes to protect those we arrest. I mean, that might sound odd. I mean, you would think our job is only to protect citizens or victims, but it's not. It's also to protect those that we arrest and to make sure that when we do arrest them, that they are accorded their rights, that they're treated not just humanely but well, and that we are responsible for initiating that process before the courts intervene.
Tell us a little bit about how, in practice, you at the DEA can make that happen. It's a large agency,
I've been told.
Many boots on the ground.
That's
How
right.
do you disseminate that message beyond hitting send on an email from the top to make sure that it is done in practice?
Yeah,
What have you learned? We have problems in this country today about lapses in conduct and in those contexts.
Yeah.
And what have you learned about how we can tackle that problem?
Hitting send on an email, Betsy, is almost virtually useless. That is not the way to lead, and it's not the way to manage. And by the way, those are two very different things. What you have to do is live it. And what you have to do is live it over and over and over again. And so I mentioned I did 120 field office visits. Every single one of those field office visits included a presentation on stuff we were working on at the DEA. We built a compliance program. We built an insider trading program, insider threat program, not an insider trading program, insider threat program. We did risk modeling. We did a whole bunch of things to sort of make the agency better and healthier. But the first slide always was our core values. This is who and what we are. No matter how painful it is, this is who and what we are. And by the way, I don't think you get any credit for the first visit to an office. You have to go back again and again and again, and you have to repeat the message. Look, the men and women who are drawn to federal law enforcement, by and large, are really good people, right? These are not rule breakers. They tend to be rule followers, but you have to give them the rules to follow. And then you have to both reward and punish. Right? When we have bad actors, and we do, our internal justice has to be, swift, fair, and final. And when people do the right thing, which they overwhelmingly do, we have to find ways to recognize it. So it's not just hitting send on an email. So we teach this at Quantico. Like I said, we recruit for it, we train on it, and we try and promote it throughout our ranks. And that was true at the Department of Justice, and it was certainly true at the FBI under Bob Mueller and Jim Comey.
Excellent. I want to shift gears to another challenging rule of law issue and question that you grappled with, and that was in your tenure as U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Virginia.
Eastern District.
Or Eastern District of Virginia.
Yeah.
I live in D.C. We think of that as Northern. But yes, and there you were responsible for prosecuting Zacarias Moussaoui in the 9/11 case, and resulted in his conviction and sentence for life.
Sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
And there was some controversy around that question, whether he should be prosecuted in a military tribunal or in the civilian tribunal. You were a proponent of the civilian course, and tell us about that position and
Yeah.
how rule of law played into it.
I was, I am, I think I always will be. Look, our military, those folks are amazing at what they do. One of the things, and I've said this publicly, and it's sort of without prejudice, that I don't think they've done particularly well is prosecute cases in military commission at Guantanamo Bay, where a number of 9/11 co-conspirators remain, coming up, now 17 years later after the attack. And it's not the fault of the folks in the military who are trying. It's that the rules weren't written in a way to permit them, I think, to proceed as efficiently and effectively as they would like. We have in the Article III system known rules, transparency, procedures that have been in place for a long time. Zacharias Basawi, by the way, was often mistakenly referred to as the 20th hijacker because, as you know, the plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, only had 4 hijackers, the other had 5. Simple math. There were 19 hijackers on 9/11. Basawi was not the 20th hijacker. We know who the 20th hijacker is. He's a man named Mohammed al-Qahtani, currently in U.S. custody in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Basawi was here as part of a second wave, or a potential second wave. Took the same training, learned how to fly, purchased some of the same things that the hijackers did, including short-bladed knives, but never was activated, if you will. We indicted Basawi in December of 2001, just 3 months after the attack. And by 2006, which is slow for the Eastern District of Virginia, he had been sentenced to life in prison. I remember early, it was either late in 2001 or early in 2002, where some of our colleagues from DOD came to the Eastern District of Virginia and essentially said, give us all your evidence because we'll have this case indicted, tried, convicted before you all figure out what happened, which was a little off-putting. But I think it was genuine. I think they genuinely thought that. It's just that the procedures where we work, the Article III procedures, are tried, true, and tested. Basawi got a fair hearing. In fact, as you may know, an Eastern District of Virginia jury voted 11-1 to put him to death, which meant he did not get the death penalty. He got a sentence of life imprisonment. While we may have been a little bit disappointed in the outcome, and frankly, I wasn't all that disappointed. The jury spoke, and that's that. The notion that you could get a fair hearing in the Eastern District of Virginia, 3 miles from the Pentagon, where one of the planes crashed, really, I think, underscores how Article III courts protect the rule of law. Basawi had every advantage a criminal defendant could have. He had tremendous court-appointed attorneys. He had a very, very good judge who very carefully protected the record and his rights. And by the way, this may sound odd, he had really good prosecutors. And why does that matter? Because it's part of our job as well to protect the rights of the defendants who come before our courts. I think working together, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and the judge ensured that it got a fair trial. And by the way, it ended 12 years ago. Right? And these cases continue to limp along in Cuba, and I think that's a mistake.
And yet, it seems in the public perception and politically...
I shouldn't say in Cuba, I should say in Guantanamo Bay. That's not really Cuba.
Right.
Right.
I think it's somewhat mysterious and challenging to me, I think to the American Bar Association, to the legal profession, that politically the public seems still to favor the military commission's Guantanamo, the military approach, as opposed to the civilian process. How do we more effectively, think maybe putting on your MSNBC hat, how can we more effectively communicate to the public, to our political leaders, the benefits of the legal, regular civilian criminal justice system?
It seems odd, Betsy, that we have to make a case for fair, efficient, and effective trials. Right? I mean, that's essentially the thing we're trying to plug. It should be apparent. I guess the counter argument is that there's a chance that some really, really bad guys go free. We almost saw that happen, by the way, in a Southern District of New York prosecution of a terrorist named Galani who was acquitted on all but one charge. on that one charge, he received a sentence of life imprisonment, but some critics of the Article III system for terrorism defendants point to that as an example where we came awfully close to losing an entire case against a very dangerous and bad person. My response, not to be flip or glib, is that's the way it goes. That's our system. We've agreed to those rules. We ought to abide them. We ought not make different rules just because we have defendants who are particularly dangerous. We can talk about our record of success in Article III courts against terrorism defendants. It's extraordinary. But I'm not sure we're going to penetrate the collective skull on this one. When people say terrorists, we automatically think that they should be getting a different system of justice and a different system of rights than bank robbers and drug dealers, and that is just not the case.
I want to turn to take some questions from the audience, but maybe before I do that, you all can be thinking about the questions you want to pose. Let me put one last to you, Chuck, and that is...
Make it easy?
Oh, no, it's my hardest.
All right.
I've been building to this one. And that is coming back to our rule of law index for 2017, 2018, and the statistics that we heard from William and we'll hear more of in a minute about the decline in rule of law in the United States. And I'd just be interested in your take on that. What do you think is the situation with the rule of law? Is it under threat here in the United States in our criminal justice system? How concerned do we need to be?
Well, at one level, concerned, because it seems that we are moving in the wrong direction. On the other hand, I've spent my entire career in federal law enforcement, and so my experience might be a little bit different than what you see in state and local jurisdictions. So I actually am quite heartened by the federal law enforcement and justice system. I think we recruit the best. I think we have the best, including court-appointed attorneys, federal public defenders, federal agents, prosecutors, our Department of Justice trial attorneys. And so I in some ways, and this may be completely unfair, Betsy, I would disaggregate the two. I think our federal criminal justice system works extraordinarily well. I'm less optimistic about certain states and certain localities and their ability to execute on this. The rule of law generally, I've made this argument on MSNBC, mostly to my mother, who I think is the only one who watches, is that the rule of law is holding in this country. That our federal courts, I believe, have acted as a bulwark, if you will, against some of the things that have happened more recently. And Justice Gorsuch said something in his hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, not original, but it struck me because I hadn't heard it in some time, which is that the United States government not only can lose, but does lose in its own courts. I'm proof of that, by the way. Plenty of hearings that sort of didn't turn out the way I might have liked, a trial or two here or there, where I was the prosecutor and we lost. But I think that's an extraordinary testament to the rule of law in this country. As I said, I'm more concerned about a number of states, the resources that they provide to indigent defendants, the dockets of many state judges, which seem to me to be overwhelming, the conditions in some of our state and local prisons, which concern me. So it's almost like a tale of two cities. The city in which I lived and worked, I think, is very healthy.
Okay. Well, that's quite provocative, I think, for our next panel to dig into. But before we move to that discussion, are there questions for Chuck in the audience? Yes, sir. There's a mic coming to you here. If you could introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Judge Joseph Roskowski, Rhode Island. Early in your presentation, you mentioned that you issued a rule within half an hour. It was out in the New York Times. What needs to be done to toughen up our system with the eyes only or need-to-know kind of rules that we have?
Yeah, so, Judge, it's a good question. At least in my case, what I wrote wasn't classified. And I also sent it to 16,000 people. So, I guess it would have been surprising if it didn't get out in some form or another. If you're talking about classified information, it's very disheartening to me. because when I was at the FBI and working in highly classified programs, it was inevitable in each day's paper that I would read about one of our programs. I can tell you as a matter of fact and as a matter of law, prosecuting leak cases is extraordinarily difficult, particularly if we don't make a determination as a government that we're willing to subpoena reporters and hold them in contempt if they don't give us information that the grand jury seeks. There's a real tension there, and I'm not quite sure how to resolve it. Leaks happen all the time. In my case, I would say it was a leak of information that was wholly unclassified, but having prosecuted or at least investigated leak cases, having prosecuted espionage cases, I think we ought to be pretty reluctant to put reporters in the dock. I think that that could be dangerous. We ought to reserve it for the most extraordinary cases. And I think other than that, I don't mean to be glib, I think it's the price we pay for a free and vibrant press.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, Bill.
Chuck, some observers would say that one of the most powerful
Do you want to? Okay.
the most powerful institutions in the criminal justice system is prosecutorial discretion.
Yeah.
You've been one heck of a prosecutor. Can you tell us a little bit about how you wrestled with, in terms of how you used your judgment and discretion, and whether to bring a case or what kind of a case to bring? It's not very well understood by the public, I don't think, and yet it is, I think, one of, if not the most powerful aspects of criminal justice.
So you're spot on, Bill. And I will say this, young prosecutors, and I was a young prosecutor at one point, I'm an old one now, are vested with an enormous amount of responsibility and autonomy, right? The responsibility is one thing, the autonomy quite another. And I can tell you I was much better in many ways at the end of my career than at the beginning. And like a lot of prosecutors, you're only good when you have a lot of data points. And you don't have a lot of data points when you're brand new. Despite having had Professor Salzberg for criminal law at the University of Virginia, I didn't know what the hell I was doing in my first, half dozen trials. I'll also tell you that in my very first trial, I sat on the wrong side of the courtroom till the court security officer came over and moved me. And so you just lack sufficient data to inform your judgment when you're new. And U.S. attorneys' offices, at least the ones in which I worked, tend to be very horizontal organizations. Not a lot of hierarchy, not a lot of management. And so AUSAs are given a bunch of cases and off they go. And you learn on the job. And I got to tell you, I regret some of the charging decisions I made as a young federal prosecutor. I don't mean that they were unjust. I mean that they were overcharged. I don't mean that the folks didn't do what we charged them with. I just meant that later, 10 years later, 20 years later, I think I was much more thoughtful in the way that I brought cases. And by the way, and you know this, Bill, you can do justice by not bringing cases too. You can do justice by not indicting certain people, or indicting them but not seeking sentences of imprisonment. There's a whole lot of options available to a good prosecutor. And I think, like everything else, airline pilots and cardiologists, you become good with, experience. It's a great question. It's not a great answer.
All right. I think we're going to be shifting to our panel, but maybe I can wrap this part of the session with one last question to you, Chuck.
Yeah.
And that is maybe to segue to the discussion about what it is that is being done to strengthen the rule of law in the criminal justice system and what should be done. What would be your recommendation to this audience, to the American Bar Associations, to state and local bar associations, to just lawyers, members of the legal profession here in the United States, even if we're not practicing in the criminal system, to shore up the rule of law?
And by the way, and I don't mean to imply, Betsy, that the federal system is perfect, because obviously it's not. We're human and we make mistakes. All humans are fallible. We're human, therefore we're fallible. I think is that a syllogism? I think so. But what we have to do as people who love the rule of law is advocate for it. And one way to do that, I think, is to lobby for resources at the state level. We probably need more judges in Rhode Island, I would imagine. We probably need more and better public defenders. We need to pay them better. We need to make it attractive for someone to pursue that line of work. You know, federal prosecutors are paid better than federal public defenders. Why in the world is that? I mean, that's crazy, right? We're both representing important clients. And so I think we need to be advocates for the criminal justice system. We need to be willing to pay, you know, in my case, I'm happy to pay more taxes for more criminal justice services. We need more jails, we need more probation officers, we need more judges, and we need to pay our public defenders better. By the way, if we're going to pay public defenders better, what the hell? Let's pay prosecutors better too. But I think we have to make an investment in it that we just don't seem to be willing to make. And I think that's incredibly troubling, and I think an organization like the ABA and the World Justice Project can advocate for that.
Okay. That's a good to-do list. I'm going to invite you all to thank Chuck for this stimulating framing of our discussion. Now we're going to shuffle the deck chairs and invite a group of experts to talk about their work addressing these very challenging topics. And hearing some from our Chief Research Officer at the World Justice Project, Alejandro Ponce, about our findings on rule of law in the criminal justice system. And we're going to invite all of you to also vote on your perspective on rule of law. So I'm going to, as we're moving chairs, ask you to look at the piece of paper on your chair that tells you how you can use your smartphone. Usually at these kinds of events, we're telling you to turn that thing off and put it away. Now we're asking you to take it out and to get ready to use your smartphone to vote on your perspectives on the rule of law and the criminal justice system. Thank you again, Chuck. Great discussion to start our conversation.
I'm going to speak for 10 minutes or less. And the idea is to provide a framework of what the people in the U.S. think about some issues, the rule of law in general and the criminal justice system in particular, and how those responses compare to responses from other people around the world, as a way to provide a framework for the conversation that we're going to have. So, first of all, just the data that I'm going to present are the result of an exercise that we produce every year as part of the Rule of Law Index. The Rule of Law Index is a comprehensive measure of the rule of law that we have been building for the last 8 years, or been producing for the last 8 years, and that we could produce annually. It includes a series of indicators that provides a comprehensive measure. We collect information for more than 113 countries. And very importantly, it provides indicators on the rule of law from the perspective of the people. That is key. So it's one of the very few indices that have the people at the center. So this is how people actually experience and perceive outcomes or manifestations of the rule of law rather than the laws or the institutions. So before understanding the index, just before, I would like to present a definition of the rule of law. Rather than reading it, I will invite you to read it by yourself, and then I will summarize it. So it composes 4 universal principles. So as you can see, the government is accountable. Then we have good laws, or the laws are clear, stable, protect fundamental rights. We have good process for enacting, administering, adjudicating those laws, and accessible impartial dispute resolution mechanisms. So that's a very basic framework of the rule of law. What we do in the index then is to look at manifestations of this. If you imagine trying to measure this is extremely hard. So then we look at manifestations of the rule of law in terms of factors or indicators that somehow summarize this basic idea that the government is accountable, that everyone should obey the law, and that we have this fair process. So the way that we do it is through 9 factors. The first 4 essentially summarize some limits that the law imposes on the authority of the state. constraints on government power, absence of corruption, open government, and fundamental rights. And the factors at the bottom essentially summarize some of the duties that the state fulfill towards its citizens, or limits that the state puts on society, just order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. Each one of these factors are disaggregated into further indicators. In each one of your seats, you have a copy of the Rule of Law Index for you to take home. You can read each one of the different indicators and the explanation for each one of them on page 14, page 15, so I'm not going to go over them. The way to measure this is simply asking people and asking lawyers in each one of the countries. In each country, we interview 1,000 people. Very simple and straightforward questions about their day-to-day that somehow reflect just how the rule of law applies in their countries. At the same time, we also interview lawyers. We know that people rarely interact sometimes with the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, so we interview lawyers, so they act as agents of the public. Overall, this exercise summarizes the views of about 2,500 lawyers all around the world. We have different questionnaires, about 500 questions overall that match or that help just to build the Rule of Law Index. These are some pictures of the actual fieldwork in 113 countries, just how we go and interview people. 110,000 household surveys, more than 3,000 experts interviews, and in 113 countries. So this is an example of a few questions. I'm not going to go over them, but it's just simple questions that help us produce these indicators. And obviously the scores and rankings in the end. We summarize all that information into the 48 sub-factors that we aggregate into 8 factors, and then come up with a figure to come up with a score and ranking. You can download the report and look at interactively online, but we also present the results for individual countries. So in the case of the U.S. ranks 19 out of 113 countries. And we also provide information in the form of country profiles. That allows to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each one of the countries that we index. And I'm going to stop here so that we see a little bit some of the results for the U.S. and some of the strengths and weaknesses of our country. So constraints on government power, for example, just 16 out of 113. Just this is consistent with what we heard before. Just overall, the rule of law is strong in the country, but there are still some areas that require some attention. So if we see, for example, open government, 13 of 113. However, there are some issues, for example, which is the core of this conversation on the criminal justice system that ranks 20 out of 113. If we go deeper into some of the analysis, and I don't expect that you see, I mean, you have the country profile in your book if you want to go into detail, but on the corner at the bottom are some of the results for the criminal justice system. And this is the same thing. So where we can see some of the strengths and weaknesses. For example, effective investigations. If I ask you, where do you think the U.S. out of 113 countries rank? Where would you say? 6 out of 113. If I ask you about absence of discrimination in the criminal justice system, where would you say? 78th. 78th out of 113. Just lower than many countries with lower levels of economic development. If I ask you about due process, 28th. Corrections, effective correctional system, 25th. So finally, just to go into the substance of our conversation, just invite you to download the app. And I'm going to show you some results, but before I want that we play a little bit and that we try to get some responses from you. Okay, so there you have just the app. And I'm going to ask you to type in the first screen what are the main issues that you think the criminal justice system in our country is facing. Just type whatever comes to mind. Discrimination. I may have biased that answer just with with the ranking before, but then you have, there you go, discrimination, incarceration, bias, prisons, delays, rehabilitation, access. So let's look at 3 issues in particular. Accountability, police accountability. Just you can type whatever answer you think fits best. The basic rights of suspects are respectful by the police. Always, often, rarely, or never. What do you think? So this is what the people in the U.S., so the interviews of 1,000 people in the USA, which is very consistent with what we were seeing before. Just most people say often, so always and often is 71%. And if we look at the international comparison, when we ask the same question in countries all around the world, so these are for the most part high-income or just these are high-income countries, 72, you see how it compares, for example, with countries in other parts of the world, in Europe. Another question. If members of the police violate the law, they are punished for these violations. Always, often, rarely, or never. What do you think? Often and rarely, just rarely, 42%, never, 9%. Same thing if we aggregate always and often. Look how we compare with the rest of the countries. 50% of people say that when police violate the law, always or often are punished for the violations. Other issues, impartiality and discrimination. Just this is a scenario. Imagine the local police detain 2 persons equally suspected of committing a crime. In your opinion, which of the following characteristics will play one of them at a disadvantage? What happens if the suspect is poor? Will that put the suspect at a disadvantage? Yes or no? If a suspect is a woman? Wow. If the suspect is a racial minority? Well, this is how it looks in the data. So for the most part, for example, a woman, 33%, a racial minority, 65%, and a poor person, 66%, is still much higher than the average of other high-income countries. Correctional system. So this is what we had before. Some of the most serious problems facing the U.S. correctional system. That's what you answered. So this is just part of the survey that we ask to lawyers in the U.S., criminal attorneys in the U.S. And this is some of the issues that they identify. Excessive use of incarceration for minor crimes. So in a scale of 0 to 10, when 10 is a serious problem, 7.2 is identified as the most serious problem that the U.S. is facing. Harsh conditions and overcrowding, poor rehabilitation programs, and recidivism. If we compare that with other countries, just the excessive use of incarceration is identified as the main problem in the U.S. and much higher than in other countries. And the poor rehabilitating programs and recidivism is also high, not as high as in other countries. Excessive length and use of pretrial detention, just in between. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. And this is just simply a way to spark the conversation that we will have. Thank you.
So let's go into a little more detail now. And let me start by seeing if we can take one thing off the table. Because I do fill out this survey. The issue of corruption, and by that I mean namely bribery of judges, prosecutors. Would you all agree that in the United States that is a very minor issue? We would, right? I mean, as compared to other countries, one of our criminal justice section people the other day we talked about going to one of the newly emerging countries and talking about rule of law and anti-corruption. And somebody asked him, no bribes? How do you get electricity? I mean, we don't think about it that way in the United States. So let's take corruption off the table and let's go to the issue right away that most of you identified as a huge problem, and that's racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. So, Jeremy, you've studied this for years. You are as aware as anybody that 2/3 approximately, given any given day, of our jail and prison population are minorities, largely African Americans, Hispanics. How do we get there?
Thanks for the easy question, Steve. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming out and thank the ABA and the World Justice Project for this invitation. So I think that there's a two-part answer for a very complicated problem, but one is we have to recognize that the intersection between criminal justice policy and the history of slavery, the legacy of slavery in this country are deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. So any American sort of analysis of the situation of the disparities of outcomes in the criminal justice system by race has to acknowledge that this is part of the American dilemma. And that's a longer discussion if you'd like to have it, and there's lots of efforts to try to sort of think through this. Brian Stevenson, in many ways, is in the lead in Equal Justice Initiative. How do we come to terms with this as a matter of what would in other countries be called a truth and reconciliation process? This is deep. We can't make progress, in my view, on the issues of racial justice and the criminal justice system until we come to grips with that legacy. The second answer, also I think a very deep phenomenon in American society, is that we need to recognize that the current operations of the justice system are markedly different from what they were 50 years ago. And this is, as Professor Salzberg knows, I chaired a panel at the National Academy of Sciences that examined the causes and consequences of high rates of incarceration in America. How did we get to a place where we have so many people in prison and jail relative to any other country? And the recognition that it has not always been so. We used to have what we would call European levels of incarceration up till early 1970s, and then something happened. We started to go on this upward trend. We've come down a little bit, but nothing particularly noteworthy in the last couple of years. And that analysis is a deep political question, because most of those increases were driven by our democracy. We brought this about by mandatory minimums, lengthening sentences, the war on drugs, things that we elected people to do in our name have brought us to the point where we have this deep intersection between the criminal justice system, particularly incarceration, also applies to policing, and issues of race. So here's one data point for the day. A young African-American male today who's a high school dropout, because of our policies, not because of his behavior, but because of our policies, has a 67% likelihood over his lifetime to spend at least a year in jail, a year in prison. So that has not always been so. It used to be 15% 50 years ago. So we have made choices through our democracy to be very punitive, and those have intersected with race, poverty, and it's mostly men.
I want to go back to some of this later on, but Angel, I have a question. You're working in the community, dealing in I understand, with the problem of returning citizens, people who've paid their dues are coming back to the communities. There are people who say that what we now have is a new apartheid, that we have decimated certain communities in Chicago. You look at the number of, particularly males, of minority males in a community who've been sent away to prison. And it's almost like something's wrong with you if you're not part of that group, right? When they come back, how successful are we at getting them housing, jobs, education, breaking the cycle of recidivism that we've seen for so long?
Yeah. I mean, we're not successful at all, and it starts way before someone is moving out of the system. If we look at a neighborhood like Austin, where there's incredibly high rates of drug use and drug sales, we know that the use of drugs in a neighborhood like Austin is actually by white folks who live in the suburbs as much as it is by people of color who live in Austin. A neighborhood like Austin, we spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in that neighborhood, but we don't spend very much of it on building jobs or any kind of economic base, but instead we spend all of that money on police officers, on locking people up. So there's actually a fair amount of money that we could choose to use in different ways, but instead we decide to use it, we elect to use it to lock folks up. And because there's such a poor economic infrastructure in those communities, as you might imagine, it leads to folks getting in trouble. And then they go into the system, and we have very little empathy for people who go into the system. When they're in the system, there's very little support for them within jails or within prisons. Many of them shouldn't be in jail in the first place, but they can't afford to pay bail to get out. And so they end up sitting in jails oftentimes for long, long periods of time. And we don't think very much about rehabilitation. As you know, most folks who have a record have a really, really hard time finding jobs. There aren't a lot of job training programs, so even for corporations that are actually interested in hiring ex-offenders, it's really hard to find the right workers. We do a really terrible job at rehabilitation.
I want to go back and talk about detention later, but Jennifer, to you, there are people who say our correctional system is totally misnamed. We don't correct anything. In fact, what we do is we school people in bad behavior. There was a correctional head, a really wonderful woman who headed the Maryland Department of Corrections. She spoke to the criminal justice section once, and she said, what we should be doing is, if we're going to put somebody in prison, the day that person arrives, we should begin to plan for his or her release. That we should, from that day on, figure how we are going to correct problems, provide training, deal with mental health or emotional issues, and figure out how that person's going to live when we let them out. But they fired her after a while. I mean, and here in Illinois, are we doing that? Are we preparing from the moment somebody enters a correctional institution for their release into our communities when they come out?
So the answer is no, we're certainly not. But I would also say that it's not because we don't think that's important. I mean, I think if you were to ask any of the corrections officials in Illinois, they would actually very much agree with the statement made by the former Director of Corrections in Maryland. And for those of you who don't know the John Howard Association, we are hardly known for defending the Illinois Department of Corrections here in Illinois. So I say that because we have several different problems, and the problem isn't always that a state Department of Corrections doesn't recognize what the importance of rehabilitation in terms of promoting successful reentry, which is key to reducing recidivism. They're often ill-equipped and under-resourced to do that, even if they want to. So nobody ever envisioned prison as being a place of rehabilitation, at least in Illinois, when they started building our prisons hundreds of years ago, when we put them away from urban centers, when we made it impossible for people to stay in touch with their loved ones, when we hired people to be security officers, not mental health providers, not rehabilitation specialists, how we built this system was not designed to correct. It was designed to incapacitate, and that's one of the few things that our system does well. So we don't do it well. I don't think it's not because we don't want to. It's because in many ways we can't. We've taken a problem that doesn't belong in the criminal justice realm and left it there, right? Angel has pointed out, and as Jeremy made mention of when we talk about discrimination and its role in fueling mass incarceration, prison is where you end up when sort of every other system has failed. So to think that that one system is capable of correcting all of that the way it's currently conceived of and resourced, I think is an impossibility.
So let me go back to something that we saw on the screen before, and that is being poor in our criminal justice system. In 1963, the Supreme Court decided Gideon versus Wainwright, which was supposed to give indigent defendants the right to counsel. 40 years later, the American Bar Association did an examination of Gideon, revisited, and discovered that the promise of Gideon had never been fulfilled, that public defenders were overworked, appointed lawyers were underpaid, that many defendants just went and pled just to get things over with, and that in fact today here we are in 2018, and in many places we're no better off. The quality of representation, I'm putting aside the federal system, because the federal system has federal defenders who are well paid compared to most defenders. They may not be as well paid as prosecutors. But does the community that we all come from, Jeremy, start with you. Surely the American people at some level don't understand how underfunded this criminal justice system is. They think lots of money is being spent, and lots of money is being spent. But poor people get the short end of the stick, and that's clearly true, isn't it?
Angel made a point which we should keep in mind in answering your question, Steve, which is we spend a lot of money on criminal justice, but our investment portfolio, if you want to call it that, is severely out of balance. So we spend $80 billion a year on prisons. We have an incarceration rate for prisons that's 5 times that in European countries. That incarceration rate has, as I said before, has risen significantly. And it's almost like we didn't pay attention to the fact that we were investing so much taxpayer money in a response to something going wrong in a community. And we didn't ask the question, and our elected officials didn't, and ultimately this is a problem for our democracy, as to how could that money have been spent differently. So if you were to rebalance the portfolio and say that $80 billion could be spent in this way, or this way, you'd start with Angel's observation about what happens in poor communities. You'd end up, it wouldn't take long before we'd get to your question about how would we have a fair and well-resourced justice system. And we would end up having to face squarely the issue about why do we put people in prison for so long in America? Why do we have so many, we have geriatric prisons now, of people who are on dialysis machines. How did we end up here? I mean, this is really an American sort of tragedy, I think, that we have ended up spending so much money at one part of this system at the expense of places where the investment would have been a better investment.
So I'll help on this one. When you talk to people in the communities that have been decimated by the incarceration rate, do they look at the criminal justice system as a biased, awful system for which they have no respect?
I think people are torn. We do a lot of work with reporters and with the communities that reporters cover around this issue. And if you talk with people in low-income communities in Chicago, they actually want to have police officers in their neighborhoods. People like me might disrespect the police, but in low-income communities, people understand that they need to have the police. So I don't think that they disrespect the system in that particular way, but they know that they're victimized by the system, and we see it over and over and over again in ways in which middle-class people would not be victimized. Police officers walking out of meetings with young people in low-income communities. In those communities, people know exactly which police officers are taking advantage of the power that they have. They know which police officers are not. But they have no recourse. And I think they're perfectly aware of how the system works, and especially older people in those neighborhoods, I find, are somewhat optimistic about being able to fix it. I find that young people are less so.
So Jennifer, I don't know how it is in Illinois, but California, where I'm a member of the bar, one of the most powerful unions, might be the most powerful union, is the Correctional Association officers. They lobby really hard and well. They lobbied building more prisons. They were largely responsible for the overcrowding that got so bad that the Supreme Court required them to release some people. In terms of Illinois, do you have this issue of powerful Correctional Officers Association, and do they lobby, and is this part of why resources are being spent one place rather than somewhere else?
Well, the answer is we do have a very powerful union. The AFSCME is the union that most correctional workers belong to, and their numbers are big, they're well-resourced. I would say their hold on correctional policy is a little bit different now than it's been in the past, because I think there's more pushback. And I think that it's made for some interesting and unlikely alliances along the way. So, for instance, their concern right now is that as we move to other alternatives, as Illinois begins to decrease our reliance on incarceration, which we are starting to do, not nearly at the level at which we need to, but we're currently down about 13% from where we were at a high of close to 50,000 inmates about 5 years ago. The concern then becomes closing prisons. So right now what we're seeing is a lot of talk about institutional violence, how unsafe this job is, and the reason they'll tell you is because of the awful people we have. These are not people that can be rehabilitated. These are people that need to be contained, and as evidence they will offer, any kind of assault that has happened inside of a prison. Now, one of the things we took notice of is none of this information is tracked, or it is all anecdotal. There is absolutely no data on this. So we actually passed a bill in Illinois just this past legislative session to require that the Department of Corrections collect this information and make it publicly available, so that we are not listening to stories of someone who said, I was beaten by an inmate and it's unsafe in there, and, don't you listen to anyone who says we shouldn't be incarcerating, every single one of the 41,000 people we now have in custody, in state custody here. And so it's interesting, and a lot of that is to keep us from shutting down prisons, because what's one of the other things we know when we talk about investment and the role of prisons socially is that so many of the prisons in Illinois were built at a time when they created jobs. And so there is this interplay with other economic factors in the state that impacts jobs, and politicians take note of that kind of thing. So we are sort of swimming upstream in terms of what the union goals are and what justice really demands.
So let me put a question that goes to the quick of all this to each of you, a couple of them actually. I'm going to ask each of you this question. Do you believe that a poor person in the United States is likely to get justice in our state courts? On the odds. Good, fair justice.
I say no, but not. I respectfully disagree that they get justice on the federal level also.
Go back. Okay. Jeremy?
No.
Alejandro? No. Jennifer?
No. But
Okay.
can I compare it to the federal system just briefly?
Absolutely, because I think Angel wants to do that too.
Yeah, so I say this as a former staff attorney at the Federal Defender Program here in Chicago. So having been in both federal prisons and state prisons and seen some of the differences, I would agree. There's certainly not justice in the federal system, but if you're to compare that certainly to the state of Illinois, I think the differential is quite noteworthy. And one of the reasons is because federal defenders are far better resourced than county public defenders are here in Illinois. But I think that there is also, the system just functions on a more effective, efficient level where the opportunity for justice to play out is greater.
I think I want to expand upon my answer, my quick no. One of the ways in which American punitiveness, and we have a deeply ingrained punitive impulse in our history and our culture has played out recently that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, is the way in which we have offloaded the costs of the system on the people who are being supervised or prosecuted by the system through imposition of fines and fees. So there are a number of, and I'm now at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and have been there 10 months, and fascinated by this opportunity to make a difference in my field and for my country. And one of the things that the Arnold Foundation has highlighted, invested in significantly, is just trying to document the phenomenon of offloading costs on poor people. So your question, Steve, about this intersection between poverty and the system, I think we know pretty well the way in which money bail intersects with poverty, but the relatively new reality of people having to pay for their supervision, pay for their electronic monitoring, pay for their drug testing, pay for their jail time in jails. Here's speaking of Gideon, pay for their indigent defense. They have to pay. We charge people in some states for their indigent defense services. So what happens when these fees are not paid is that there's some sort of warrant issued to bring somebody into court. So the police show up, there's a warrant issued, you go to court, and you're held in jail. So we have the modern phenomenon of modern version of debtors' prisons, and Peter Edelman just published a really just bracing book about this. So the intersection of poverty, race, the justice system, and as a burden on communities of color, poor communities, there's just a new reality that we've not seen in this country before.
I just want to, excuse me. I just wanted to raise one point about our federal system. Chuck, I think he's right that the federal system on the whole operates better than in many states. But when you look at why we dropped in the rankings over the last year, one can't miss something that was really important, and that is this association, American Bar Association, has been opposed to mandatory minimum punishments for 40 years. And we worked hand in glove with other associations to form Clemency Project 2014, to petition the Justice Department to release some of the people who got hammered with these mandatory minimum sentences, many of them African-American young people who got caught with minor drug trafficking offenses and got 20 years, 35 years. And more than 1,000 of these people got released. New administration came in, and what did the Attorney General do? He immediately revoked Eric Holder's policies, withdrew his policies, and issued a directive to all federal prosecutors that they should pursue the most serious punishments. In other words, back to where we were. And that message got out. And the Attorney General, of course, is a figure who speaks to the states. He made it very clear that in his view, these huge sentences that you talked about, Jeremy, they were just. We shouldn't worry about them. And so, as you were saying, these are dangerous people and need to be put away. And the American people saw that. And the other thing, and then I'll go back to a question that I think is a reality, is many people don't differentiate when they see immigration arrests. They don't differentiate that from the criminal justice system. It all looks the same to them. And when they see heavy-handedness, and they get a sense it's not fair. And when they see DACA being put in jeopardy, it all goes to a piece about whether they rank justice in the United States, as being better than it was. And not surprising we dropped. But I do have a question about racial justice. So tell me how you feel about this. The problem of racial discrimination in criminal justice has gotten significantly better over the last 10 years. Yes or no, Uncle?
Not that I know of.
Jeremy?
So significantly better. There's a welcome new level of public awareness about this issue. Has that translated into significant changes on the ground? Not yet.
Alejandro? How about you, Jennifer?
I would agree. Increased awareness, but that hasn't translated into improvement.
All of us would probably agree, however, that this focus that we've seen on implicit bias and training and awareness is one of the healthier things. Wouldn't you agree? That we have seen in criminal justice in a long time. But I wondered, I'll ask at least the three of you this question. If there's something that you saw in our criminal justice system that is a huge improvement in any area, whether it's policing, whether it's running our correctional institutions, whether it's prosecutorial discretion that Bill Newcomb asked about, is there something you can point to say, this is really good? It doesn't have to be nationally, but it's good somewhere, and we ought to look to it as a possible model?
I mean, in Illinois, and I think sadly we don't talk about jails very much, but jails is where, people start. And in Cook County, anyway, I do think we've seen a lot of progress in keeping people out of jail in the first place. I know that the population of Cook County Jail, I think, has gone down from something like 10,000 to like 6,000 people. I think, our awareness of the impact of people not being able to pay for bail has been responsible for a lot of that. So I do think we've made some progress in Cook County in jails.
Jeremy?
I'm notwithstanding what's happening in Washington, and that's I know not a minor, putting something to one side. I'm still heartened by the bipartisan left-right coalition or sort of recognition, consensus that exists that we have gone seriously off the rails in this country, and we're seeing significant changes in states. Interestingly, in southern Republican states, Louisiana. Who would have thought Louisiana would be a poster child for justice reform? So that's real. The other thing that I find heartening is the new attention on elected prosecutors, and there are a number of races around the country where people are running on progressive reform platforms. This is an office that, given the earlier discussion we heard from Chuck about this, that is often neglected in terms of its power. And to think that that's a focal point for the reform movement, and many of those prosecutors are saying that they're going to, in their office, if they're elected, reduce sentencing, reduce disparities, throw out minor cases that are unworthy of the justice system. So that's heartening.
Anything in corrections that you really are happy about? It doesn't have to be Illinois.
Right. Well, so I would say a couple things. There are some states, as you point out, that are doing a far better job than they used to do. I think that bar is still, frankly, fairly low and not where it should be. When you look at countries like Norway and all the Scandinavian countries, when you look at Germany and the way they approach corrections, how their facilities look more like college dorms, frankly, than prisons, where people wear their own clothes, where they make their own meals, where there is a level of accountability and responsibility that is encouraged, that is fostered, that leads to improved behavior and increased success upon reentry into society, it makes you question even the states here in the United States that are improving things. But certainly in Colorado, Director Ramish has a great understanding of the impact of solitary confinement and has really made some impressive policy shifts in that correctional environment to do away with that. Connecticut seems to have a better understanding of aging prisoners and understanding that meeting their needs is different and expensive, and that we can go about that differently to the benefit of both those prisoners and the state interests. In Pennsylvania, I think Director Wetzel is doing some innovative and interesting things. There are pockets of good things that happen. I don't think we see any one system that's wholly transformed, that has the goals and the outcomes that I think we'd all like to see. So I agree with Jeremy that the conversation is starting, and there is evidence of bipartisan support for these kinds of things. And we always say, it doesn't really matter if you come with your heart or your wallet, as long as you care about the issue and would like to see the system reformed, we'd love to have you as part of the conversation. But I think of all of those aspects, the place where we're seeing the greatest traction really is in prosecutorial discretion. I think, Kim Foxx here in Cook County has been a game changer. I think the fact that even John Chisholm from Milwaukee becoming a nationally known figure, he is a quiet, steadfast reformer, hammering on the importance of responsible use of prosecutorial discretion. I think that that had been missing from the conversation for a long time, and the fact that it has been injected into it and more people consider that a factor in the conversation is one of the more obvious steps we've taken lately.
On that point, I just can't resist saying something, and that is, back in 2003, when Justice Kennedy addressed the ABA, the prosecutors' attitude towards diversion and towards reentry was very different. We went on a campaign about how prosecutors really ought to be judged not on how many convictions they can get, but how safe they can make their communities. And that meant that there were times you didn't prosecute people to put them in jail. You diverted them into treatment programs and other programs. And the toughest holdouts in the National District Attorneys Association, the ones when I went to address them, toughest ones, everyone has a reentry program now. I mean, it's been a huge change, but one thing that has not changed much in most of the United States is this: bail. If you want to know if we want to know what one of the number one reasons why poor people get shafted, and you were saying this, Uncle, earlier, we have a bail system in most of the United States still. Of all those rich countries, Alejandro, that you were listing, the ones that all do better than we do, guess how many of them have a bail system? None. We're the only ones. And why? Why do we still have it? The House of Delegates of the American Bar Association took a very strong position last year that bail should be only a last resort when nothing else would do, that should have a up or down decision. This person is fit for release, release him or her. If not, too dangerous, then lock that person up. But get rid of this moneyed system. And why don't we? Just like prison guards have their own power, bail bondsmen seem to have a lot of political clout. I think in Illinois is still a bail system. Is that true? Is it still as problematic here as it is most parts of the country? People can't make bail, they stay in jail. Or, do you see this in the system? Where the people who can't get out because they can't make bail plead guilty so they can be released, and now they have a criminal record. You see that?
Yep. Absolutely.
How often?
All the time.
All the time?
All the time.
And I mean, it isn't so much that prosecutors want that. They don't make the bail decision, right?
If I could be a little bit provocative and say, I mean, in addition to things like bail that cost money that you can count out of pocket, there are also lots of other things. I think about our sex registry in Illinois, where unfortunately there are a lot of people with developmental disabilities on our sex registry list. Those people have to check into an office once a week. They're not people who can go to an office on their own. And so their parents have to take the day off to take them to that office once a week to check in, which means it's hard for their parents to keep their jobs. I mean, it's just this incredible snowball effect because of all the ways in which we want to keep track every moment for someone who has been in the system.
So I see you wanting to say something.
I did. So a lot of what we're talking about in this conversation and similar conversations that we're all part of comes down to legislation at the state level. And at the Arnold Foundation, we're very involved in the bail reform movement. Some of that is at the local level, some of that is at the state level. But when we talk about sentencing, we talk about even police accountability, we talk about bail reform, and we talk about funding of the system. Some, but not all of that, is lodged at the level of our state policymakers. So I will be a true believer in the power of prosecutors to actually enact change when they do something more than what you said, all of which is welcome, to have prosecution-led reentry programs. When the state prosecutors associations go to the state legislature and say, let's start with bail reform. Let's add state prosecutors, state DEAs Association saying, our sentences are too severe. Then I'll be a believer. Or they instruct their assistants to ask for, as Eric did on the mandatory minimums, to ask for, and this is what Krasner's doing in Philadelphia, ask for something less than the maximum you could ask for. Ask for more but how about just changing the entire infrastructure that we've built up so that we don't say that people convicted of charges of violence who may not be violent themselves are held in prison for 20, 30, 40 years. So we've just gone so far. I think we've lost sight of how far off track we've gone. And that prosecutors can have a big role. Certainly judges could have a bigger role in this if they wanted to. And we could have sort of a voice of conscience to say that this is hurting our democracy. Certainly the racial disparities are deeply damaging to our aspirations for racial justice. But in terms of the intersection of poverty and the well-being of poor communities, we've gone off track. And we need voices, and this is where the Bar Association can play, at the state level, can play a big role.
So I have my marching orders as to when I'm supposed to invite questions, and I am relieved we are exactly at that moment. So questions are most welcome. I think we have somebody with the mic he's coming, as is Sunday.
Almost there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jones. I'm the founder, CEO of the 501c3 non-for-profit Inmates for Change, and we offer reentry services for returning citizens and individuals who are in the community with felony convictions. As I listen to you all, you know your stuff. I'll say that right off the top. I live in Inglewood, and which is one of the more challenged communities in the city of Chicago, with not only gang violence, but recidivism, as well as the drugs and no resources and services. The situation that I see, you brought up quite a few points, and I'm itching in this chair. I'm like, man, I'm ready to go, right? Bail seems to be an industry in itself. You mentioned the bail's bondsman. Okay, now that individual, with him having a livelihood of putting up money or accepting collateral for an individual to guarantee that he will show for his trial date or court date, is an industry in itself, a cottage industry, we should say. The other side of that is an individual being able to afford bail, but he can't based on what, his previous arrest record or his convictions, or this is now the lay of the land now where we have individuals with legislation being placed on their shoulders about you shouldn't have been doing that in the first place, and it's relatively a minor offense for an individual who, in his mind or her mind, is trying to eat. So we don't have the resources in the communities at that level. We don't have the support services that we readily need. I'm a very small startup, and what I run into is budget in continuing conversation with entities that are spending vast amounts of money on any kind of particular study or studies at any given time. And when we look toward how do we rectify part of this situation, it's from so many different angles. You just mentioned, Jeremy, that we've gone so far off of what we've gone far off of that we don't even know where we are, how to get back, and how to make something of it once we reach some kind of jurisdictional type of geographical location where we're going to start from right here, and this is where we're going to go. So strategically, what we're looking at, again, is we've got a power base that is the prison industrial complex. And it's as strong as the NRA. It's as strong as the ABA. It's as strong as the federal government. And unless we can find a way to trickle down this information to the most affected, which are the poor and minority, we're never going to ever find a way to lobby enough to get into the state legislators to have them bring this type of change about, because there's so many other challenges. Now,
well, I want to make sure we have time for other people to ask questions.
That's a good one, because right now, I'll stop, but
okay.
As you know, it's an ongoing conversation,
yeah.
And I don't want to hog the mic, so.
We appreciate the work that you're doing. It's important work. And
May I respond to him?
Yes, please.
I appreciate what you said, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I can appreciate that you don't have enough money to do the work that you need to do. I will say that I run an organization called Illinois Humanities, and we do have small grants. And we can also put you in touch with the folks at the MacArthur Foundation who may or may not be interested, but this is the kind of work that they say that they're interested in.
I see a hand. Yeah, right over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sebastian Albuja. I'm director of the Africa Division with the ABA Rule of Law Initiative. We implement programs overseas to support the rule of law. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have programs in 6 countries, and many of those programs are precisely on the criminal justice. So I have 2 questions for the panelists. The first, what advice do you give us in terms of strengthening the criminal justice sector in sub-Saharan Africa, where honestly I believe that we have a different problem than what has been discussed here, which is a problem of lawlessness, which is an absence of police, absence of prosecutors, lack of qualified judges. But nevertheless, what sort of words of caution would you give us as we work in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo or Central African Republic or Liberia to strengthen the criminal justice sector so that we don't end up with these sort of aberrations that have been described here? The second question relates to deterrence. I haven't heard anyone mention deterrence. I have come across research before showing that it's not necessarily the strength or the hardness of a penalty, but the possibility of being punished that deters people from committing crimes. Is that true? Do you think that any of the things that criminal justice sector does actually work to deter crime, and how those may operate in places of extreme lawlessness, such as sub-Saharan Africa?
When Richard Nixon was president and he got questions like that, 2-part questions, he would always say, let me take the second part first. I don't know why. We're going to do that. Take the second part first about deterrence. And I'm going to ask Jennifer and Jeremy in particular, and just remind about something. When Congress enacted the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 and formed the Sentencing Commission did a lot of studies and basically found that the length of incarceration bore almost no relationship to recidivism. It was the things that mattered the most were the certainty of being caught and punishment. And then they violated every one of their findings and set up a guideline system that was so cruel and harsh that it's hard to believe. Isn't it true that there are data out there that suggest it's certainty rather than length that matters most?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of research that also, and frankly, Jeremy's conducted a lot of the research, so I'll defer to him on a lot of that. But there's a lot of research that shows that prison doesn't act as a deterrent. I mean, one of the reasons is because we fail to act swiftly and with certainty, and so we lose a lot of the impact it might otherwise have. But the length of a sentence certainly has no deterrent impact. I mean, really the only thing our prisons do well is incapacitate. And the question is that what we want them to do? Is that a good thing for them to be doing? And how is that benefiting us as a society? I think it's thinking about deterrence and thinking about lawlessness. I mean, I don't know that I have any one good answer, and I also am under the impression that this is sort of a time-limited panel, and that's a really big, deep, hard question to answer. But what I would say is, you know, in many ways, the United States, and with specific states more than others, being a cautionary tale for taking the idea of correcting lawlessness too far. And I think that among the more important principles to bear in mind is equal distribution of power. And when that calculation is off, you begin to see what you see in this country.
Let's take the second part about the length of incarceration.
So you're right. The literature, this goes back to Jeremy Bentham, so long ago, that the severity of the punishment is far less important than the certainty or the celerity, how quickly you're punished. And we have, as Steve said, just gone so far in the other direction, out of this notion that somehow if we got really, really tough, maybe that would have an impact. I think actually we got really, really tough because we think that's sort of the thing to do. It's part of our retributive nature. But I think I would frame the question, far be it from me to say anything about sub-Saharan Africa, I know nothing, but just frame the question slightly differently, which is not what the system can do to produce safety, but how can safety be produced where the system response is part of a larger response. My only experience in South Africa, I spent some time in a township where there was no police, there was no court system, and my colleague, a scholar, was doing some research there. try to understand how does a community without the system maintain social norms. So you can start there, and you can get a lot of power out of informal social control and leaving formal social control to be a supporting role rather than the main role. We've made it the main role, and we've diminished the powers of informal social control in communities and because we rely so much on formal social control.
And I would also say that one of the things we've done that brought us to where we are is politics has generated our criminal justice policy, not policy. I mean, we led with politics and not policy. And when, politics simply does not make for good criminal justice policy. Frankly, the driving forces behind it, the purpose behind it, the goals of politics are wholly contrary to criminal justice. And so it's not just having a vibe of being interested in retribution over rehabilitation. It has to do with the fact that politicians got more bang for their buck. They were more likely to be elected if they stood up and said, I'm tough on crime and we've got to put people away for longer and more. And, that's what we saw starting in the late 80s, certainly the 90s and early 2000s in this country. That's how people got elected. And so, I don't know what the political processes look like there or what can be done to control for that, but I would think long and hard about how you drive that ship and how you can put policy before politics.
And one more thing about sub-Saharan Africa. Only Americans think they got the answer to everything. Right. We don't. And the idea that, by the way, we've done a great job. The ABA, Raleigh, done a great job of training judges in the former stands and other places because their system has emerged and grew, and they wanted some training of judges, and not necessarily only how we did it, but how we do it and other countries do it that may have a civil system as opposed to an adversary system. I mean, there are lots of models, and I think that there are certainly societies that have done very well with community judgments, basically, as you say, community controls that don't necessarily involve starting with a police force, which can quickly become an oppressor and make things worse. But I think the answer for us is that's a big one that we don't have, even this panel doesn't have the arrogance to tackle. We have a question here. Is it your hand?
Well, yeah.
We use the mic, even though we know you have a big voice. But
we talked a lot about criminal justice. Let's talk about juvenile justice for a minute. This, of course, is the home of the invention of the juvenile court in 1899. And juvenile justice in the United States has enjoyed a sort of a renaissance, talking about the rehabilitative ideal and a belief, indeed, that children are different, sort of impelled by the United States Supreme Court, thanks to Bryan Stevenson in no small part. So the question is this renaissance sustainable, or instead can we anticipate some retrenchment?
I can answer that. For those of you who don't follow juvenile justice, the patterns in juvenile justice parallel what we've seen in the adult justice system. That those of us old enough to remember will remember that in the 70s, the crime rate soared. We had a call for tougher law enforcement, a call for mandatory minimums, more police, do away with parole, and that's how we ratcheted things up, as Jeremy talked about, and put ourselves in the position that we're now in. We had a parallel track, as you know, for juveniles. It used to be the case that it was the exception, that somebody who was a juvenile would be tried as an adult. It soon became the norm. Prosecutors in many places got the right to direct file, that is to say, I'm charging you. Court doesn't have to approve it as an adult. And the penalties became tremendously high. The system just was as punitive on the juvenile side it became as we were doing with adults. And then we've had a second look. A number of jurisdictions said, largely led by the Supreme Court, striking down the death penalty for juveniles, recognizing that the juvenile brain, that it develops much differently than a lot of legislators had assumed. And there is a retrenchment against these harsh punishments, not everywhere, but the right now, the momentum seems to be to reform juvenile justice. Fortunately, juvenile justice is in the states, and the states have done much better at a lot of these things in experimentation than what we see the federal government going back to, as I mentioned earlier. So my own view, I don't know whether you agree, I think that we're on the right track in juvenile justice.
It's an interesting comparison between the adult system, as you started out by saying, let's talk about the juvenile system, these two trajectories side by side. Steve mentioned there was this up and down. We saw tough on crime, and we also saw a significant outbreak of youth violence in the late 80s that was a very scary phenomenon to watch. But it led to the super predator mantra, and we have to get tough. We have reversed course as a country on juvenile justice much more dramatically than we have in adult system. The juvenile detention rate, if you want to call it that, has dropped by half across the country over the last 10 years or so. The juvenile crime rates have plummeted through the floor, and it's in part because of the understanding of brain science. But I would just like to make it a political question. Why has that happened when it was so easy for us to demonize young people in the 80s and before, and it hasn't translated to the adult side? Is the kids just different? We treat them differently, but is there a way to think that those lessons can be projected?
So I think
if you're asking me a question, here's my answer. The MacArthur Foundation. The MacArthur Foundation spent over 20 years
Yep.
a huge investment in supporting
Yep.
brain science,
Yep.
adolescent development, a host of reforms. Those notions made their way not once, not twice, but 4 or 5 times to the United States Supreme Court, and heavily influenced the development of juvenile justice reform.
And since we're doing it,
that's why I asked the question.
Jennifer was going to jump in.
The foundation is now no longer supporting those reforms. We're leaving it now to the states and folks like us to sustain those reforms. I asked a question about whether we could do that.
So just to give you a sense of what's happening in Illinois, and this is obviously the home of the MacArthur Foundation, and I say this, the John Howard Association has been the beneficiary of the MacArthur Foundation's generosity for many years, and we were part of their Models for Change initiative, which really drove a lot of the juvenile justice reform work, not only in Illinois, but across the country. I think there's a couple things that make the juvenile system different. First of all, it's smaller. It's just when you look at the numbers and what you can do in terms of numbers of people, numbers of institutions, and numbers of dollars, it's an easier system to have impact in. And nobody likes to talk about that. That doesn't sound touchy-feely and justice-minded, but it's true. So in 2012, we locked up about 1,200 youth here in Illinois. Today, we're under 400. So a lot of it was the nationwide movement and being able to pick up on those trends. But in general, we have better luck politically, frankly, in selling justice around juveniles than we do adults, because there is this burgeoning idea or recognition or acceptance that brain development is real and people can change. Now, we put a cap on it, an artificial cap, right, that only, between 18 and 24 or younger than that, they can still change because that's when the brain's still developing. After that, well, I think that's one of the artificial and very unfortunate delineations we've made. But we are starting to see more progress than that. But because so much of it is subject to politics, it'll turn back.
My script tells me that it is time for us to turn this back to you.
Thank you all very much for a very stimulating discussion.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. On behalf of the World Justice Project, our board, our colleagues here at the American Bar Association, particularly the Criminal Justice Section and the Division for Public Ed, we're really delighted that you could join us for an important discussion, and thank our experts in particular for helping us understand better where the gaps in rule of law in our criminal justice system are and what we might do about it. We at WJP pride ourselves in catalyzing research about the rule of law and gathering data and doing analysis about the rule of law, diagnosing the problems, and identifying solutions, and then connecting change makers around the world, in the United States and across the globe, to support each other, share best practices, learn what's working, what's not. And I think today has really been a good example of that kind of a conversation. I want to point folks to the criminal justice section and its activity working on these issues on an ongoing basis. They've got the Racial Justice Improvement Project and also their standards work, which are important resources for those of you who want to continue to dig into these topics and contribute to that work. I also want to point you to the Division of Public Ed resources. There are materials in the back of the room that you can use to convene these kinds of conversations in your communities and organizations. And finally, I want to, if my colleague will switch it's in my hands to do this. There we go. Point you to the WJP Resource Hub, which is a new online resource that we have to connect innovative organizations around the world working on different rule of law topics. There are a couple thousand organizations now working on rule of law in this web resource, and this is an example of how you can search that resource for organizations working on criminal justice in the United States, and then access information about those organizations, the kinds of work that they're doing, and connect with them. So we hope that you will find this useful in your work, and that through this online resource and these kinds of convenings, we can continue this conversation and move forward together to address the issues we've identified today. Thanks again to our panel.